Do you think you know the limits of this world? You are mistaken. There are cracks, forgotten paths, doors that should never be opened. And the world, it is full of them. They are waiting for wandering travelers, for the curious, for people like you. As you listen, tell me, which story touched you the most? Which horror seemed the most real? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe so you won't miss our next encounter with the unknown. And leave a like if you felt the blood grow cold in your veins. Take care of yourself and never turn back onto the old path. Tonight, we will peer into a few such cracks. We will visit places where tradition demands a terrible price, and hospitality hides an ancient horror. Close your eyes. Imagine this road. It leads deep into the unknown. You are walking it. And now, let us begin. It was a story I heard, recounted by a man who claimed to have seen the evidence himself, though he never elaborated on what that evidence might be. A chilling whisper from the forgotten corners of the mountains, a tale spun in the dying light of a tavern, leaving a prickle of unease long after the last word faded. It concerned a young, outwardly happy couple, drawn, as many often are, to the quaint allure of the remote. They had, it was said, embarked on a journey to a small mountain village nestled deep within an ancient valley, seeking a respite from the clamor of their modern lives and, perhaps, a touch of authentic local charm. Their destination was a place known only as Oakhaven, a name that evoked images of rustic serenity, of sturdy trees and peaceful isolation. They had been drawn there by an old, tattered flyer, discovered in a dusty antique shop, that spoke in lyrical prose of Oakhaven's annual Midsummer Festival, a celebration steeped in tradition, culminating in a grand feast that promised local delicacies and ancient rituals. The couple, described as curious and adventurous, had regarded it as a unique opportunity, a chance to immerse themselves in a culture untouched by time. The journey itself was reportedly long and arduous, the road dwindling from paved asphalt to a winding, gravel path, then finally to a barely discernible track that snaked precariously up the mountainside. The woman, it was recounted, had expressed a certain trepidation as the familiar world fell away behind them, replaced by towering, silent peaks and dense, whispering forests. Her husband, however, had reportedly reassured her, pointing out the beauty of the untouched wilderness, the crisp, clean air, and the promise of an authentic experience. They were city folk, after all, and the allure of the unknown, the untouched, often outweighed any nascent unease. Upon their arrival, the village of Oakhaven presented itself much as depicted in the faded flyer, a cluster of timber and stone houses, their roofs thatched with straw or covered in moss-laden slate, clinging to a steep hillside. Smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the sweet perfume of mountain wildflowers. The streets, if they could be called that, were narrow, cobbled paths that wound between the buildings, occasionally opening into small, communal squares. The villagers themselves, the storytellers recalled, had emerged from their doorways to greet the newcomers, their faces etched with the lines of hard-won lives, their eyes holding a disconcerting depth that the couple, at the time, had attributed to the wisdom of the mountains. They had been met with a warmth that was almost overwhelming, an unusual effusiveness that had initially charmed them. The villagers, the man had later recounted to those who would listen, seemed genuinely delighted by their presence, regarding them with an almost proprietorial interest. They had been told that guests were rare, and their arrival for the festival was considered a blessing. The days leading up to the feast were filled with the gentle rhythms of village life, punctuated by preparations for the culmination of the festival. There were communal gatherings, simple dances to the mournful strains of a stringed instrument, and the sharing of stories by the firelight. The couple, it was said, had found themselves feeling increasingly at ease, despite the language barrier that necessitated much communication through gestures and shared smiles. They had been pleased with their choice, believing they had stumbled upon a hidden gem, a true sanctuary away from the hurried world. The villagers, though always polite, possessed a certain reserve, a quiet solemnity that the couple found endearing, seeing it as a mark of their ancient ways. Yet, there had been subtle things, too, that went unnoticed or were dismissed as cultural quirks. The villagers, it was noted, seemed to avoid direct eye contact for too long, their gazes often flickering to the couple's hands or, more strangely, their chests. And a peculiar, earthy scent, like damp soil and something more indefinable, always seemed to linger about the older inhabitants. The day of the grand feast finally arrived, a day marked by an unusual shift in the mountain air, a sudden chill, despite the summer season, and a deepening of the shadows that seemed to cling to the edges of the village. The couple was escorted to the central square, which had been transformed. Long, sturdy wooden tables, hewn from rough-hewn pine, stretched across the square, laden with an array of dishes unlike anything they had ever encountered. Lanterns, crafted from hollowed gourds and animal bladders, cast a flickering, amber glow, illuminating the expectant faces of the villagers. A large bonfire crackled merrily in the center, its smoke rising straight into the darkening sky, carrying hints of unfamiliar herbs. The village elder, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose eyes held an ancient, unblinking quality, had welcomed them with a deep, resonant voice. He had reportedly spoken of the festival's history, of communal bonds, and of the sacred connection to their ancestors, whose spirits, he had intoned, returned on this special night to partake in their bounty. He had then, with a sweep of his hand, urged the couple to try everything, emphasizing that to refuse any offering would be considered a grave insult to the spirits and to the village's hospitality. And so, the feast began. Plates were passed, bowls refilled, and the couple, initially hesitant, soon found themselves enveloped in the ritual. The dishes were indeed, as promised, strange. There was a jelly, shimmering with an ethereal luminescence, studded with small, intensely shiny berries that, in the dim light, seemed to glow from within, emitting a soft, cold light that pulsed with a life of its own. When the woman had cautiously sampled it, she had reportedly felt a sweet, almost crystalline taste, followed by a fleeting chill that spread through her mouth like melting ice. Next, they were offered platters piled high with meat, carved from an animal the couple could not identify. It possessed a peculiar, almost unnatural, golden hue, shimmering as if dusted with fine metal. The man, a seasoned traveler, had recalled thinking it might be a local game, perhaps prepared with an exotic spice. Upon tasting it, the texture had been described as surprisingly tender, almost dissolving on the tongue, leaving behind a rich, earthy flavor, accompanied by an odd, almost electric tingling sensation that resonated deep within his bones. Then came the wine. Served in rustic, unglazed ceramic goblets, it was a deep, swirling liquid, the color of amethyst and dried blood. When the man had raised his cup to drink, the woman had reportedly gasped, pointing with wide eyes. For a fleeting moment, a faint, almost imperceptible halo of golden light had shimmered around the rim of the goblet, an effect that vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the dark liquid. As they drank, the woman had later confided to her husband that she had seen a similar, brief aura around the man's hand, and then, to her utter astonishment, around her own. The villagers, seeing their surprise, had reportedly chuckled softly, explaining that it was merely part of the festival's magic, a blessing from their ancient wines. They had found the wine intoxicating, not just in its alcoholic content, but in a deeper, more pervasive sense, spreading a warmth throughout their bodies, dulling their senses to everything but the immediate, glowing moment. They ate and drank, urged on by the unblinking, encouraging gazes of the villagers, who seemed to monitor their consumption with an almost unsettling attentiveness. The elder, in particular, had ensured their plates were never empty, his deep-set eyes seeming to pierce through them as he pressed another dish upon them, always reminding them of the importance of partaking in all the offerings. The couple, feeling increasingly full, warm, and strangely light, indulged, attributing their odd sensations to the potent local brews and the sheer novelty of the experience. They had laughed, perhaps a little too loudly, their initial unease replaced by a joyous, almost blissful surrender to the moment. Eventually, as the moon climbed high, painting the mountain peaks in silver, the feast began to wind down. The couple, feeling a profound weariness mixed with an unusual euphoria, had been led back to their small guest house. They had bid the villagers good night, expressing their sincere gratitude for the incredible experience, for the hospitality and the unique culinary adventure. The villagers, the storytellers recalled, had smiled back, their gazes still holding that unnerving depth, their farewells echoing with a strange, almost knowing finality. The couple had fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep, the unfamiliar food and potent wine weighing heavily upon them. It was much later, in the oppressive silence of the pre-dawn hours, that the woman first awoke. A strange, pervasive chill had settled in the small room, cutting through the heavy blankets. She recalled feeling an odd sensation, a buzzing beneath her skin, a peculiar lightness that made her feel almost insubstantial. She had stirred, her eyes adjusting to the profound darkness, and that was when she first noticed it. A faint, silver glow, emanating from her own hand, which rested upon the rough-spun blanket. A gasp caught in her throat had reportedly startled her husband awake. He had murmured a question, his voice thick with sleep, asking what was wrong. She had, with a trembling hand, shown him her palm, now unmistakably radiating a delicate, pearlescent light. His eyes, upon seeing it, had widened in disbelief. He had then, in turn, noticed the same inexplicable luminescence emanating from his own skin, a soft, ethereal silver light that pulsed gently, mirroring the beat of his heart. Their bodies, they soon discovered, were bathed in this strange, internal glow, turning them into living, breathing beacons in the pitch-black room. Fear, cold and sharp, had begun to cut through the lingering euphoria of the feast. They had questioned each other, their whispers filled with growing panic, wondering what could possibly be happening. They had touched their skin, discovering it felt unusually warm, almost as if they were radiating a gentle heat. The man had reportedly suggested they look out the window, perhaps to see if there was a strange light source outside, a natural phenomenon they were unaware of. What they had reportedly seen from their guest house window had chilled them to the very core, freezing the blood in their veins. The entire village, despite the late hour, had gathered in the central square, directly facing their guest house. Hundreds of figures, silent and unmoving in the stark moonlight, their forms indistinct, like shadows stretching but never quite solidifying. They were not, the couple had instantly understood, ordinary people. In the cold, unflinching light of the moon, which cast long, dark shadows from every tree and every stone, the gathered villagers cast no shadows at all. Their forms, though seemingly human, absorbed the light, leaving only a disconcerting void where a shadow should have been. Their faces, what could be glimpsed of them, were reportedly vacant, their eyes reflecting no light, only a terrible, ancient hunger. It was in that moment, as the silver light within them pulsed more intensely, and the silent, unshadowed gathering stared fixedly at their window, that the horrifying truth had reportedly dawned upon them. The grand feast, the unusual dishes, the insistent hospitality, it had not been a festival, not a celebration, but a meticulously planned ritual. The food, the glowing jelly, the golden meat, the halo-inducing wine, they understood now, had been seasoned with something far more insidious than exotic spices. They were, the couple had realized with a soul-shattering clarity, condiments from the Eden world, concoctions designed not for flavor, but for purpose. The food had been bait. It had been prepared to illuminate their very souls, to make them visible, substantial, and utterly irresistible to something that lurked beyond human comprehension. The villagers, they now knew, were not just hosts. They were the guardians, the keepers, the servants of these otherworldly beings. The ancestors they had spoken of, whose spirits returned on this special night, were not benevolent spirits. They were entities, ancient and hungry, drawn by the beacon of newly awakened souls. The villagers, it was said, offered strangers as tribute, feeding these insatiable beings to ensure their own continued, unshadowed existence. The soft, silver light now pouring from their bodies was no longer a curious phenomenon. It was a death sentence, a glowing invitation. The silent crowd outside, the unshadowed villagers, were merely the first ring of the trap. Beyond them, in the deeper shadows of the mountain, stirred the true predators, drawn by the irresistible glow of their illuminated essences. The couple, trapped in their guest house, could hear a faint, soft murmuring beginning to rise from the silent throng outside, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, a sound that was less a human voice and more a collective, eager anticipation. The light from their bodies intensified, a brilliant, silver luminescence that pierced the darkness, rendering them painfully visible. They were no longer tourists, no longer guests. They were the feast. The story ends there, or at least, that is where the man who told me the tale fell silent, his eyes wide, as if still seeing that terrible, unshadowed gathering and the terrifying, beckoning glow of newly illuminated souls. He never spoke of what happened next, of what became of the couple, only that the village of Oakhaven, to this day, still holds its annual midsummer festival, and sometimes, a pair of unsuspecting travelers, seeking charm and authenticity, still find their way up that winding mountain road. They thought they had found paradise, authenticity, real life. But sometimes the real isn't what we seek. Sometimes it seeks us out. Food can be a trap, and celebration a ritual. And your soul can be a beacon in the darkness, calling out to something old and hungry. But what if you're not a victim? What if you're a merchant? The story, as it was told to me, began as most such tales do, with a lone traveler, a mountain range, and the encroaching shadow of night. They say that the mountains themselves are ancient, older than memory, and hold secrets tucked into their crags and valleys that human understanding can barely grasp. Among these secrets, perhaps the most unsettling, is the legend of the night market. Folklore had always painted a vivid, if whispered, picture of its existence. A market that appeared only after sundown, in gorges so sheer and impassable that no ordinary path could lead there. A place where the currency was not coin or jewel, but something far more personal, far more profound. Something intangible. People spoke of grandmothers who had traded the memory of their first love for a cure for the wasting sickness, of artisans who had bartered away their talent for painting in exchange for a single, perfect note of music, of forgotten poets who had sold their very capacity for joy to banish a grief too heavy to bear. The cost, it was always murmured, was never truly known until long after the trade was done. Our protagonist, Maria, was not one to chase legends. She was, as the story goes, a woman of practicality, accustomed to the concrete world of cityscapes and schedules. Yet a restless spirit had led her to these ancient peaks, seeking a clarity that her urban life had somehow obscured. She had ascended with a light heart, enjoying the crisp mountain air and the panoramic views. But the mountains had a way of shifting, of asserting their own will. A sudden, unseasonable storm had descended upon her, a furious squall of wind and icy rain that whipped around her, stripping away her sense of direction and her initial optimism. Night fell with shocking speed, plunging the world into an inky blackness punctuated only by the furious flashes of lightning that revealed, for a terrifying instant, jagged peaks and treacherous drops. Maria, disoriented and chilled to the bone, stumbled through the tempest, desperately searching for shelter. There was a moment, she would later recall, when the wind seemed to guide her, pushing her not towards a familiar path, but down a narrow, rocky fissure she was certain had not been there before. It was a passage so impossibly tight she had to turn sideways to squeeze through, her pack snagging against the rough rock face. She remembered thinking it was a foolish desperation, a final act of surrender to the elements. But then the wind died. The rain ceased its drumming. And the air, which had been thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, now carried a strange, sweet perfume, mingled with something metallic, like old copper, and a faint, unsettling tang of ozone. She pushed through the last narrow opening, utterly unprepared for what lay beyond. The gorge opened into a vast, cavernous space, lit not by moonlight or stars, but by 1,000 shimmering, bioluminescent fungi clinging to the sheer rock walls, casting an ethereal, shifting glow. Below, spread out on what appeared to be impossibly smooth, black stone, was the market. It was a tableau pulled from a fever dream. Booths constructed from driftwood and polished bone, draped with fabrics that seemed to breathe and shift in the faint light, lined the cavern. Figures moved amongst them, some tall and gaunt, others squat and formless, their movements fluid and unsettling. They were adorned in cloaks woven from shadow, or garments that seemed to absorb and emit light simultaneously. There was no discernible sound of human chatter, only a low, resonant hum, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very air, from the products themselves. Maria felt an icy dread coil in her stomach, a primitive fear screaming at her to flee. But something held her. Perhaps it was the sheer impossibility of the sight, the way it defied every rational explanation. Perhaps it was the lingering chill from the storm, and the seductive warmth emanating from the market's heart. Or perhaps, as some would suggest, the market had chosen her, sensing a particular void within her that it could exploit. She moved deeper, her steps tentative on the unnaturally smooth ground. The wares on display were as bizarre as the vendors. She saw what looked like crystal phials, each containing an eddying mist, and she heard a nearby vendor explaining to a potential customer that these were bottled childhood scents. The smell of rain on hot asphalt, the aroma of a grandmother's kitchen, the metallic tang of first blood after a playground fall. Another stall offered dolls crafted from woven moonlight and dried sinew, their tiny, painted lips moving in perpetual, soundless compliments, their eyes following her with an unnerving intensity. One display, particularly chilling, held rolled parchment maps, each labeled an elegant, looping script, the place where you lost your courage, or the crossroads where your dream died, or the spot where your luck abandoned you. The vendor, a creature whose face was obscured by an elaborate, feathered mask, simply gestured vaguely, indicating that one merely had to point to the desired location on the map, and the knowledge of how to reclaim it would be whispered into their ear, for a price. Maria was drawn, despite her burgeoning fear and rational alarm, to a stall where the goods seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. The vendor there was a slender figure, draped in robes the color of twilight, its face perpetually in shadow beneath a wide, brimmed hat. Its hands, long and skeletal, gestured gracefully towards its wares. Amongst them, nestled on a bed of what felt like cool moss, was a tiny glass ball. Within its flawless sphere, a miniature fire danced, a vibrant, continuous flicker, radiating a soft, golden warmth. It was, Maria thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She found herself tentatively reaching for it, her fingers brushing the cool glass. The vendor seemed to lean in, though she could not discern its true features, and a voice, like the rustling of dry leaves, informed her that it was a unique item. It was, the vendor explained, a store of happiness for a rainy day, a concentrated essence of joy, ready to be released when the world felt too gray, too heavy. She felt an immediate, magnetic pull towards it, a desperate need for the promise it held. The vendor then explained that the price, naturally, was not silver or gold. Maria swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. She wondered what such a thing might cost. The vendor seemed to sense her unspoken question, its shadowy head tilting slightly. It communicated that the price was a specific memory, one that she found particularly cherished, yet perhaps did not think she needed anymore. A memory of pure, unadulterated contentment, small and simple, a quiet joy she had perhaps forgotten the true weight of. She thought of many things then: the warmth of her mother's hand in hers as a child, the exhilaration of reaching a mountain summit, the quiet satisfaction of completing a challenging project. But the vendor, as if reading her very thoughts, seemed to imply that it needed something more specific, something that resonated with the very joy held within the orb. Finally, a memory surfaced, unbidden, a quiet afternoon she had spent years ago, sitting by a sun-drenched window, reading an old book, a cup of perfectly brewed tea steaming beside her, feeling utterly at peace, a feeling of deep, uncomplicated bliss. It was a memory she loved, but one that felt, in the grand tapestry of her life, rather insignificant. She felt a strange lightness, a conviction that she could spare it. She nodded her assent, though she did not know precisely how the transaction would occur. The vendor simply extended a skeletal hand. As Maria reached out, a faint, golden tendril seemed to draw from her mind, a fleeting echo of warm light and soft paper and the aroma of tea. It coiled gently around the vendor's fingers before dissolving. The tiny glass ball, now undeniably hers, pulsed brighter in her palm, radiating a soft heat that spread through her chilled fingers, offering a strange comfort. A sense of peace, fragile and fleeting, descended upon her. She clutched the ball tightly, feeling a strange mix of accomplishment and unease. The market, however, began to press in on her. The whispers grew louder, no longer a cacophony but distinct, insidious suggestions slithering into her mind. She heard a voice from a nearby stall offering a cure for loneliness, asking in return for all her future dreams. Another vendor touted a bottle containing perfect self-love, but the price, it was made clear, was the capacity for empathy. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken needs and dark desires. The ephemeral lights seemed to pulse with a predatory hunger. A sudden, overwhelming urge to escape seized her. The comfort from the glass ball was fading, replaced by a growing dread. She turned, intending to retrace her steps, to find the narrow fissure that had led her into this nightmare. But the path was gone. Where the opening had been, there was now a sheer, unyielding rock face, indistinguishable from the other cavern walls. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile sense of peace. She felt a presence behind her and turned to see the vendor who had sold her the ball. Its shadowy form seemed to have grown, to loom larger in the flickering light. The vendor's voice, a dry rustle, seemed to settle directly into her mind, informing her that leaving the market was, like all things of true value here, a trade. It explained that one could not simply take from the market and depart without offering something in return. The cost for entry might have been a memory, a talent, a dream, but the cost for exit was always far more fundamental. Maria felt her blood run cold. She argued that she had nothing left to give, that she had already paid for her purchase. The vendor merely tilted its head in that unsettling way, and other figures, drawn by the implicit drama, began to gather around them, their forms indistinct, their whispers growing in intensity. They seemed to hum with anticipation. The vendor then communicated that the market took only what was essential, what was intrinsic to existence. It was observed that she still carried something quite significant, something that countless others desired, something that rarely found its way to the market. Maria looked around frantically. She patted her pockets. She had no possessions of value. Her backpack held only utilitarian hiking gear. What could it want? She racked her brain, desperate. Then she noticed. The flickering lights of the market, the strange bioluminescence, cast no shadow of her own. She looked to the ground where her form should have been mirrored in darkness, but there was nothing. No shade to cling to her feet, no elongated form stretching behind her. She had been so consumed by the strangeness of the market that she hadn't noticed the absence until that very moment. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air raced through her. The vendor, as if understanding her sudden, horrifying realization, made a slow, sweeping gesture towards her feet, and then to the ground. It clearly indicated what the market now demanded. Her shadow. A collective murmur rippled through the gathering figures. They whispered, or perhaps she merely perceived their ancient thoughts, of the rarity of such a trade, the profound power held within a true shadow. They spoke of shadows as anchors to the self, as reflections of spirit, as the very essence of one's being that only the purest light could reveal. To sell one's shadow, they insinuated, was to sever a fundamental connection, to lighten one's load in a manner most absolute. Maria felt an abyss open beneath her. Her shadow. It was so fundamental, so much a part of her, an unspoken constant in her life. To lose it felt like losing a limb, or worse, losing a part of her very soul. She cried out, or perhaps she merely thought of crying out, that it was impossible, that she could not. But the vendor, its voice now laced with an undeniable, chilling authority, explained that the path out of the market required payment. There was no other way. And indeed, many buyers for such a unique commodity had already gathered. The figures surrounding her pressed closer. They were not solid beings, but shifting configurations of mist and intent. One, a tall, spindly thing that moved with a jerky, insect-like grace, communicated that it would use her shadow to glide unseen through the world, to steal secrets from sleeping minds. Another, a low, guttural presence that seemed to emanate directly from the rock itself, promised to anchor her shadow to the deepest parts of the earth, using its essence to nourish ancient, forgotten roots, to draw power from her very being. A third, a shimmering, almost beautiful entity, whispered that it desired her shadow to weave into a cloak of invisibility, to become a phantom in the waking world, leaving no trace. Each proposed a different, insidious use, each a horrifying violation of what her shadow represented. Maria felt herself shrinking, her refusal growing weak in the face of such overwhelming, alien hunger. The weight of the market, the impossibility of escape, pressed down on her. The tiny glass ball with its flickering fire felt cold in her hand, a mocking testament to the false hope she had bought. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was truly trapped. Her life, her very self, was now forfeit. She would only later recount the exact moment of the severance. It was not a physical pain, she said, but a profound, existential wrench. A feeling of being unmoored, of a vital cord being cut. The air around her seemed to shimmer, to distort. Her form felt lighter, almost insubstantial. And then, with a strange, collective gasp from the surrounding entities, a dark, perfectly shaped silhouette detached itself from her feet. It was a fluid parting, like ink from water, leaving behind an absence that was more palpable than any presence. The shadow writhed for a moment on the smooth, black ground, a perfect, dark replica of Maria, before it was set upon by the eager buyers. They converged upon it like carrion birds, their misty forms tearing at its edges, each claiming a piece. It was a silent, horrific dismantling, one that left Maria feeling hollowed out, utterly vulnerable, as if a part of her very soul had been laid bare. Once the shadow was gone, consumed by the ravenous market, a new path materialized before her as suddenly as the old one had vanished. It was a narrow, winding tunnel, dark and uninviting, yet it promised escape. The vendor, its form now seeming almost satisfied, simply gestured towards it. There was no need for words. The transaction was complete. Maria walked. She moved with a strange, ethereal lightness, as if her feet barely touched the ground. The market, with its eerie lights and whispering vendors, receded behind her, the passage sealing itself with a soft, grinding sound that vibrated through the rock. She emerged into the pre-dawn gloom of the mountains, the storm now completely gone, replaced by a cold, clear sky. The air felt thin, sharper somehow. The familiar world lay before her, but it was irrevocably changed. She looked down at her feet. No shadow followed her. Even in the faint light of the rising sun, her form remained solitary, unbroken by any darkness. The glass ball in her hand, the store of happiness for a rainy day, felt like a dead weight. She opened her palm and stared at the flickering fire within. It still danced, but its light seemed diminished, somehow colder, a desperate, contained joy, utterly separate from her. She wondered if it would ever truly warm her, or if the price she had paid had hollowed out the very capacity for such warmth. The man who told me this story, a grizzled old prospector, his eyes wide and haunted, said that he had encountered Maria weeks later, wandering aimlessly on a remote mountain trail. She was pale, her eyes distant, as if constantly searching for something that was no longer there. He had described her as moving with an unnerving grace, a dancer without an audience, a ghost in plain sight. She spoke of the market, of the lost memory, and of the shadow. He remembered her saying that the world felt flat now, that color seemed duller, and that the ground beneath her feet was strangely insubstantial. She had also confessed that she often felt a pervasive chill, an internal coldness that no amount of warmth could penetrate, as if the very darkness that once defined her and anchored her to the world had been ripped away, leaving a void. He couldn't say what became of her, only that she kept walking, always towards the rising sun, as if trying to outpace the darkness that no longer clung to her. He supposed, with a shiver, that she was still out there, a woman forever walking in the full, unforgiving light, forever seeking something she could no longer cast. And the market, he concluded, still waited, somewhere in those impassable gorges, for the next lost traveler, for the next intangible trade, for the next shadow to claim.
What would you give for happiness? For health? For the fulfillment of a wish? Memory? Talent? A dream? And what if the price turns out to be much higher? What if you have to pay for something you never even thought about? A part of yourself that you thought was eternal. Your shadow. Yourself. And after the deal, the world loses its colors forever, and you are left as an empty vessel wandering in light without darkness. But there are other ways to lose yourself. Other rituals.
The story, as it was told to me, began with a man named Philip, a restless soul who sought solace not in bustling metropolises but in the hushed, ancient corners of the world. He had found himself drawn, almost by an unseen current, to a small, secluded resort town nestled deep within the Austrian Alps. The air, he had noted, was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow, a stark contrast to the stale, worn air of his own life. His intention, he had clearly stated to anyone who would listen, was simply to relax, to allow the serene grandeur of the mountains to wash away the accumulated anxieties of modernity. The town itself, so I heard, was a picturesque postcard come to life, all timbered chalets and geranium-laden window boxes, yet beneath its charming facade, Philip had sensed an undercurrent, a quiet hum of something else. It was in the hushed conversations among the locals, the way their eyes would flicker upwards towards the towering peaks, a reverence that bordered on apprehension. But Philip, ever the pragmatist, had initially dismissed these oddities as the quaint eccentricities of remote mountain folk. His chosen abode was the Omnia Hotel, a formidable structure of dark wood and stout stone, perched on the edge of a precipice overlooking a glacial valley. It was, he had observed, a place seemingly untouched by the passage of time. The reception desk was a dark, polished slab of oak, the key rack a brass board with ancient, heavy keys, each bearing an ornate, hand-carved tag. The carpets were thick and faded, patterned with swirling motifs that hinted at a forgotten past. Indeed, the entire establishment exuded an atmosphere that suggested it had remained perfectly preserved since the dawn of the 20th century, a living museum of a bygone era. Upon checking in, a process conducted by a remarkably unsmiling woman with tightly coiffed gray hair and a severe, high-necked dress, Philip had been informed of the hotel's singular, rather peculiar custom. The administrator, her voice a flat monotone, had explained that every evening, without fail, all guests were expected to participate in a game of billiards. It was, she had relayed, a cherished tradition, a nightly ritual for good cheer and camaraderie among the guests, fostering a sense of community in their remote mountain retreat. Philip, though a little surprised, had found himself nodding along, vaguely amused. It seemed an innocuous enough quirk, a charming relic of a more genteel age. He had even thought it might be rather pleasant, a way to unwind after a day of hiking. His first few nights at the Omnia had been much as he expected, if a little more formal than anticipated. The billiards room, a cavernous space with dark wood paneling and a single, immense table bathed in the glow of an overhead lamp, became the focal point of the evenings. He had played with an old Austrian couple, a reclusive academic, and a boisterous group of French tourists, all exchanging polite pleasantries and the occasional, stilted laughter. The administrator, he had noticed, always presided over these games, her gaze sharp, ensuring everyone participated, ensuring the game continued its steady rhythm. Her presence, he'd later admit, had begun to feel less like supervision and more like a monitoring. As the days blended into a week, Philip's casual acceptance of the town's peculiarities began to fray. He noticed the locals spoke often of a great arrival, their voices dropping to urgent whispers in the village square, their gazes constantly sweeping the horizon, a mixture of dread and anticipation etched into their weathered faces. He had tried once to inquire about it, asking a gnarled old man in the local tavern what this arrival entailed. The man had merely chuckled, a dry, rustling sound, and had explained that it was just an old superstition, an ancient belief that good fortune, or perhaps something even greater, would descend upon the valley at the close of the season. He had then advised Philip not to trouble himself with such village tales, telling him to simply enjoy his holiday. Yet the old man's eyes, Philip recalled, had held a flicker of something far more serious than dismissive amusement. The paintings, however, were what truly started to prickle at Philip's easygoing nature. The hotel corridors were lined with ornate, gilt-framed canvases, depicting picturesque alpine scenes, snow-capped peaks under impossibly blue skies, idyllic meadows dotted with grazing cows, serene chalets bathed in the gentle glow of a summer sunset. They were, at first glance, precisely what one would expect in such a place. But Philip, a man with an eye for detail, began to notice subtle shifts. His first morning, a painting near his room had depicted a vibrant mountain lake. The next morning, the surface of the lake seemed to have gained a faint ripple, an almost imperceptible disturbance. He had dismissed it as a trick of the light, or perhaps his own imagination. But then, a few days later, the same lake had taken on a murky hue, and the sky above it had begun to darken, a stormy gray creeping in from the edges of the canvas. A serene chalet in another painting, initially bathed in sunshine, found itself subtly shrouded in shadow, the windows appearing darker, almost vacant. It wasn't merely the light or the weather in the paintings that changed, it was their essence. A joyful scene of villagers dancing in a meadow slowly transformed into a somber, almost ritualistic gathering. The faces in the portraits subtly altered, their expressions deepening from placid smiles to something more weary, even sorrowful. Each morning, Philip would walk the labyrinthine corridors, a growing sense of disquiet settling over him, to observe the incremental, unsettling transformations. The landscapes, once vibrant and inviting, were becoming increasingly gloomy, the skies bruised, the shadows lengthening. Trees that had once bloomed with life now seemed skeletal, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the darkening heavens. The cheerful, bucolic scenes were slowly giving way to desolate, almost threatening vistas, their beauty replaced by a profound, pervasive sense of dread. He found himself thinking that the artists, whoever they might have been, possessed a terrifying foresight, or perhaps, a chilling ability to reflect an unseen reality. His nights, too, became haunted not by nightmares, but by the relentless click-clack of billiard balls echoing from the grand hall below, a sound that, at first comforting, now felt like a metronome ticking down to an unknown, ominous event. The forced gaiety of the daily games began to wear on him. He noticed the administrator's eyes, always watchful, lingering on the players, as if evaluating their energy, their focus. He had also observed that the locals, when they occasionally joined the games, played with an almost desperate intensity, their movements precise, their faces set in grim determination, completely lacking the carefree spirit of the other guests. One afternoon, driven by a gnawing curiosity that had superseded his desire for relaxation, Philip had ventured into the hotel's forgotten library, a dust-laden room filled with ancient tomes. He had hoped to find some local history, perhaps a clue to the pervasive strangeness. Tucked away on a high shelf, behind a collection of German poetry, he had discovered a brittle, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and smelling of age and decay. It was written in a flowing, elegant script, detailing the musings of a former guest, one who had stayed at the Omnia decades ago. The journal entries began much like Philip's own early experiences, appreciation for the quiet, the peculiar billiards tradition. But as the entries progressed, a chilling narrative unfolded. The author, too, had noticed the changing paintings, the hushed conversations among the locals. Then, there was a passage, almost hidden in the faded ink, that made Philip's blood run cold. The journal's author, through some unknown means, perhaps an overheard conversation or a deeper investigation, had come to understand a terrifying truth about the Omnia Hotel. It was not merely a hotel, the journal proclaimed, but a clock. A colossal, intricate mechanism, powered not by gears and springs, but by the very essence of human experience. Every game of billiards, every ripple of laughter, every story told, every sigh of contentment or frustration, every moment of living that transpired within its walls, these were the weights. These were the subtle, invisible forces that moved its hands forward, inch by painstaking inch. The journal's author had written of the dreadful realization that the Omnia was counting down, ticking towards a specific moment. And by midnight on the last day of the season, the clock must strike. The revelation had hit Philip with the force of a physical blow. The last day of the season, he had seen the dates on the hotel pamphlets, a small detail he had previously ignored. The season was indeed drawing to a close, just a few days away. The great arrival the locals spoke of, the changing paintings becoming ever more desolate, the administrator's watchful gaze, the forced billiards games, the very architecture of the hotel, so solid and unyielding, now seemed to make a terrible, coherent sense. It was all part of the mechanism. Their lives, their presence, their very joy and sorrow, were mere fuel for this ancient, terrible machine. He had tried to discuss it with the administrator, to articulate his dreadful discovery, to ask what happened when the clock struck. She had merely listened impassively, her expression unchanging, before telling him that such old tales were best left to the superstitious, and that he should simply enjoy the remainder of his stay and remember the nightly billiards. Her words, delivered with such calm finality, felt less like reassurance and more like a chilling confirmation. The remaining days were a blur of growing terror. The paintings in the corridors had by then transformed into grotesque, nightmarish visions, skeletal figures dancing in desolate landscapes, eyes peering from murky shadows, a sense of crushing despair emanating from every canvas. The billiards games became frantic, almost desperate affairs. The guests, perhaps subconsciously sensing the impending shift, played with a forced enthusiasm that bordered on hysteria. Philip, now fully aware of their unwitting role, found himself meticulously calculating his shots, playing with an intensity he hadn't thought himself capable of, as if his every move was a weight, a crucial push towards the inevitable. He saw the administrator watching, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips whenever a particularly vigorous game ensued. The locals, when they joined, played with a grim, almost ritualistic fervor, their eyes wide with a strange mix of fear and reverence. On the final evening, the air in the Omnia was thick with an unspoken anticipation. The mood was electric, charged with a tension that hummed beneath every forced laugh and every whispered conversation. The last billiards game was a macabre spectacle. The guests, sensing the finality, played with a feverish intensity, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they sent the ivory balls clacking across the green felt. Philip, too, felt the pull, the terrible urge to contribute, to push the hands of the clock. He imagined the vast, unseen gears grinding, turning, accelerated by every impact, every shared breath in that ornate room. As the last game concluded, a heavy silence descended. The administrator, her eyes gleaming with an unreadable emotion, moved to the grandfather clock in the corner of the billiards room, a clock Philip had previously dismissed as mere decoration. Its face seemed to glow faintly in the subdued light. She raised a hand, her gaze flicking between the clock and the assembled, terrified guests. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of untold centuries, of countless seasons. Outside, the first faint toll of the village bell began to chime, signaling the arrival of midnight. 1, 2. Philip felt his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around at the other guests, their faces frozen in various states of fear and confusion, none of them truly understanding, perhaps, the chilling truth he had uncovered. He did not know what would happen when the clock struck. Would time itself unravel? Would some ancient horror be unleashed upon the unsuspecting valley? Would the hotel, the great Omnia clock, simply become something else? The last chime echoed through the silent valley, a resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very foundations of the hotel. And as the final note faded, Philip, so he had recounted, heard it. Not a sound, not a crash, but a feeling. A deep, resonant thrum that seemed to originate from the very core of the building, a vibration that passed through his bones and settled in his soul. It was the sound of something vast, ancient, and utterly incomprehensible, finally settling into place. The sound of the Omnia Hotel striking. Then, there was nothing. The administrator stood unmoving, her expression still unreadable. The other guests exchanged nervous glances, some exhaling in relief, others still trembling, sensing the profound, unquantifiable shift that had just occurred. The paintings in the corridor no longer seemed gloomy, they simply were. They depicted nothing discernible, only swirling patterns of darkness and light, as if reflecting the infinite void. The clock itself, the grandfather clock in the billiards room, had stopped. Its hands pointed precisely to midnight. Philip looked at the motionless hands, then back at the administrator, who finally, slowly, turned her head to meet his gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, nor fear, only an ancient, profound satisfaction. He left the Omnia the next morning, not waiting for breakfast, not even bothering to properly check out. He simply walked away, down the mountain path, carrying with him the terrible knowledge of the Omnia, the clock, and the silent, unquantifiable thing that had struck at midnight. He never looked back. He never returned. And to this day, he cannot say what truly happened, what was ushered in, or what was completed by the striking of that terrible, beautiful clock. He only knows that the weight of every laugh, every story, every simple game of billiards, had served its purpose. And the clock had indeed struck.
We are all cogs in a great mechanism. We live, we work, we play. And every action, every emotion, is the movement of a hand on the dial of our destiny. But imagine a place where this is not a metaphor, where your game is literally a cog moving the hand of a huge clock. A clock that counts down not to midnight, but to something much worse. Something that comes when the clock stops. But sometimes you don't even need a clock. Sometimes you just need the old way.
It was a tale whispered in hushed tones, reserved for late nights when the world felt thin, and the veil between what was known and what was not seemed to shimmer. A story of the vast, indifferent heart of Central Asia, where the land stretched out like a forgotten dream, and something elemental still held sway. The journey itself had begun with the usual exotic allure. A group of Western tourists, eager for adventure, had boarded the long-distance train. Its destination lay deep within the sprawling, sun-baked steppes, a landscape of endless horizons and sky that seemed to swallow all light and sound. They were an eclectic mix: a retired couple from Germany, a young backpacker from Australia, a trio of students on a gap year from Britain, and the man who, it was said, eventually relayed this chilling account, an American photographer named Mark, always with a camera slung around his neck. For days, the train had traversed the featureless expanse. Outside, the world was a blur of dry grasses, distant mountains shimmering like mirages, and the occasional glimpse of a nomadic yurt, a solitary shepherd, or a herd of camels. Inside, life settled into a comfortable rhythm of shared meals, card games, and conversations carried out over the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks. The conductor, a stoic man with a weather-beaten face and kind eyes, would occasionally pass through, offering warm tea and a few fragmented phrases in broken English. He had seemed a figure of reassurance, a steady hand guiding them through the immensity. As daylight faded each evening, the steppes transformed. The vastness grew heavier, more ancient. Stars, untainted by city lights, erupted across the ink-black canvas of the sky, closer and more numerous than any of them had ever witnessed. It was beautiful, Mark had reportedly said, but also profoundly isolating, a beauty that hinted at an indifferent, cosmic scale. A feeling that they were merely specks, transient visitors in a land that had seen millennia pass. It was on one such night, when the moon was a sliver and the darkness outside was absolute, that the train's familiar rhythm faltered. A sudden, jarring lurch sent coffee mugs tumbling and roused sleeping passengers. The metallic groan of ancient brakes shrieked through the compartments, followed by an abrupt, ringing silence. The train had stopped. Not at a station, not even a desolate outpost, but truly in the middle of nowhere. Outside there was nothing but the vast, oppressive emptiness. Confusion rippled through the carriages. Voices, initially curious, grew anxious. Had they broken down? Was it an emergency? Mark, ever the observer, had reportedly felt an immediate prickle of unease. The silence outside was not merely an absence of sound, it was a hungry, swallowing silence. Then the conductor appeared. He was no longer the steady, reassuring presence they had come to know. His face, usually ruddy from the sun, was reportedly ashen, pale as parchment in the dim overhead lights. His eyes darted nervously, avoiding the passengers' gazes. He walked down the aisle, his movements stiff, almost mechanical. He spoke, his voice unusually low, almost a whisper, as if afraid of disturbing something outside. He told them, in halting, grave tones, that they had veered onto an old track. A track, he further explained, that had not been used in a very, very long time. He spoke of an unforeseen circumstance, a detour that was not on any modern schedule. He then conveyed, with a chilling solemnity, that they must follow the waiting protocol. The words themselves, waiting protocol, had reportedly hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken dread. Mark had recounted how the conductor then issued a series of instructions that defied all logic and comfort. Every single light in every carriage, he stated, had to be extinguished. Not merely dimmed, but entirely off. They were to plunge the train into absolute darkness. Next, he ordered them to lean against the floor, to press themselves close to the ground. And perhaps most unsettling of all, he explicitly forbade anyone, under any circumstances, from looking out of the windows. He stressed that they must remain in this position, in utter darkness and silence, until they heard the train's whistle blow 3 times. A wave of disbelief, quickly followed by a cold, creeping fear, swept through the passengers. One of the British students reportedly asked if this was some kind of joke, but the conductor's expression had been too grim, his pallor too profound, for levity. The German couple reportedly voiced concerns about safety, questioning the necessity of such extreme measures. But the conductor simply shook his head, reiterating the urgency, emphasizing that their compliance was paramount, that it was for their safety. He left them with the chilling pronouncement that they would be passing. Reluctantly, slowly, the passengers obeyed. The lights flickered, one by one, into oblivion. The familiar hum of the train's system seemed to die with them, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. Darkness, thick and suffocating, descended upon the carriage. Mark had reportedly felt it press in on him, a physical weight. The air grew cold. Passengers fumbled in the black, some whispering questions, others simply breathing shallowly. The floor felt hard and unyielding as they pressed their bodies against it, some finding comfort in the proximity of others, others feeling only a deepening isolation. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into an eternity. The carriage was a tomb. Every rustle of clothing, every choked gasp, sounded impossibly loud in the pervasive darkness. The conductor's words, "they would be passing," echoed in their minds, conjuring nameless, faceless terrors. Mark had described a primal fear taking root, a fear of the unknown that lurked just beyond the thin metal skin of their compartment. Then it began. Softly at first, almost imperceptibly, a sound drifted from the absolute blackness outside. A distant, hollow ringing, like ancient bells. Not melodic, not celebratory, but a mournful, metallic clang that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten ages. The sound grew louder, closer, resolving into the distinct, irregular tolling of many bells. They jangled and clanked, a cacophony that suggested movement, purpose. Hundreds of them, perhaps. A slow, shuffling, deliberate procession. Interspersed with the bells, another sound emerged, far more disturbing. Heavy breathing. Not human breathing, Mark had reportedly described, but something deeper, guttural, a ragged intake and exhalation of air that seemed to come from immense lungs. It was not one sound, but many, a chorus of laborious exhalations, drawing closer, surrounding the train. It was the sound of effort, of something substantial moving through the night, directly alongside the carriage. The passengers lay frozen, their hearts hammering against the floor, their ears straining to interpret the horrifying symphony outside. The bells clanged with increasing proximity, the breathing grew louder, closer, until it seemed to scrape against the very walls of the train. It was no longer a distant threat but an imminent, surrounding presence. They could feel the vibrations through the floor, a subtle tremor that spoke of heavy, deliberate footsteps. The air in the compartment grew heavy, charged with an inexplicable, ancient energy. Mark, the photographer, was reportedly a man of logic, a seeker of truth, however uncomfortable. He had always believed in documenting what he saw, in bringing light to shadows. But here, in this suffocating darkness, with the sounds of something utterly alien pressing in, his resolve began to crack. He later confessed to an unbearable tension, a frantic internal struggle between profound terror and an insatiable, horrifying curiosity. The conductor's instructions had been absolute: do not look out the windows. But the human mind, when pushed to its limits, often rebels against the very commands meant to protect it. A cold sweat slicked his skin. The bells outside clanged, seemingly just inches from his ear, a harsh, metallic percussion. The breathing, a raspy, moist sound, was now so distinct, so close, that he could almost feel it, a foul wind through the sealed glass. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they were out there, moving past the train, an unseen army in the blackness. A sudden, desperate urge, a morbid compulsion, overwhelmed him. What were they? He had to know. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling, the plastic cold against his clammy skin. Every instinct screamed at him to stay still, to bury his face deeper into the floor. But another, more powerful force propelled him. He had convinced himself, in those terror-filled moments, that he needed proof. That the world needed to know. With a furtive, jerky movement, he lifted his phone, pointing it vaguely towards the window. He didn't dare to look himself, not directly. He only wanted to capture an image, a fleeting glimpse. His thumb fumbled for the camera icon, then the flash button. He knew the risk, knew what he was defying. A part of him prayed the battery was dead, that the phone would fail him. But it didn't. A brilliant, blinding white flash erupted from the phone, cutting through the absolute darkness like a knife. It was brief, a mere fraction of a second, but in that infinitesimal moment, it illuminated the world outside. What Mark saw, or rather, what the flash revealed, was burned into his memory, forever etched behind his eyes. Standing there, directly outside the window, facing the train, were figures. Tall, unnaturally slender, draped in long, coarse, dark clothes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Their forms were indistinct, their features shrouded by the folds of their heavy garments and the lingering afterimage of the flash. They stood in a dense formation, a silent, unmoving phalanx, stretching as far as the momentary light could reach along the side of the train. But it was not their numbers, nor their dark raiment, that truly shattered him. It was their faces. Or rather, the lack thereof. For a split second, the flash had caught them. They were blank, featureless. Smooth, unmarred surfaces where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Like mannequins, but imbued with a terrifying, ancient sentience. What horrified Mark, what truly broke him, was the sudden, undeniable shift in their posture. Before the flash, they had been facing the train, a silent guard. But as the light erupted, in that frozen instant, every single one of those blank faces had turned. They were all now directed towards the window, towards the source of the forbidden light, towards him. The flash died as quickly as it had appeared, plunging the world back into an even deeper, more profound darkness. The image, however, lingered, searing itself into his consciousness. Mark had reportedly gasped, a choked, strangled sound that seemed to shatter the silence within the carriage. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering uselessly on the floor. He pressed himself back against the ground, trembling uncontrollably, his mind reeling from the impossible, the unspeakable vision. He could hear the agitated whispers of other passengers, awakened by his gasp or the sudden, fleeting illumination. Someone near him reportedly asked what he had seen, their voice trembling, but Mark could not answer. The words wouldn't form. All he could do was lie there, heart pounding, trying to regulate his breathing, convinced that they now knew. That they had seen him. The bells continued their mournful clang, the heavy breathing persisted, its rhythm now seeming to carry a new, malevolent awareness. The sounds outside continued to move, passing slowly, agonizingly, down the length of the train. Each reverberation, each breath, was a reminder of the things he had glimpsed, the things that were now aware of his intrusion. The air grew colder, heavier, charged with a palpable tension. He felt an intense, crushing pressure on him, as if something unseen was pressing down, pinning him to the floor. The wait for the 3 whistles became an eternity of profound, terrifying silence, punctuated only by the relentless, horrifying sounds from outside. He was acutely aware of the shared terror, the communal breath-holding in the dark. No one dared to speak above a whisper, no one dared to move. Then, finally, after what felt like an age that had stretched beyond the bounds of human conception, the first whistle pierced the night. It was shrill, sharp, a jarring sound in the heavy silence, yet it was also a sound of profound relief. A shiver ran through the carriage. A second whistle followed, equally piercing, then a third, long and mournful, echoing into the vast emptiness. The immediate effect was almost physical. The heavy breathing outside seemed to recede, the bells began to fade, their clanging growing more distant. The palpable pressure lifted. Slowly, tentatively, the passengers began to stir, straightening their limbs, rubbing their eyes, though no one dared to switch on a light just yet. Moments later, the conductor reappeared. He moved with the same stiff, almost robotic quality. He reportedly instructed them, in that same low voice, that they could now turn on their lights. As the carriage was once again bathed in the familiar, yellow glow, a collective shudder passed through the group. Faces, pale and drawn, were revealed, etched with shock and lingering fear. Mark, still on the floor, slowly pushed himself up. His face was reportedly devoid of color, his eyes wide and vacant, staring straight ahead. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. The Australian backpacker, who had been lying near him, looked at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, but Mark offered no explanation, no comfort, no words. He simply picked up his phone, stared at it for a long moment, then slipped it into his pocket without looking at any photos. He reportedly never spoke of that moment, not directly, not to anyone on the train. With a final, unsettling groan, the train's engines rumbled to life. The carriage's lurch then began to move, slowly at first, gathering speed as they left the old track behind, returning to the familiar, if still desolate, route. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, once a source of comfort, now sounded like a frantic escape. The rest of the journey passed in a profound silence, a heavy, unspoken understanding. The camaraderie was gone, replaced by a shared, traumatic bond. They had all heard the bells, the breathing. They had all felt the terror. Mark, however, carried an extra burden. He had seen, and he would never truly be the same. The man who relayed this story had said that Mark's eyes had a distant, haunted look, as if always seeing something just beyond the present. The train eventually reached its destination, and the tourists dispersed, each carrying their own version of the nightmare. But the memory of that night, of the absolute darkness, the ancient bells, the heavy breathing, and most terrifying of all, the blank faces turned towards the train, lingered. It was a story told in hushed tones, a chilling reminder that in the vast, forgotten corners of the world, there were things that defied explanation, protocols that spoke of deeper, older laws, and entities that moved in the dark, waiting. And sometimes, if you were unlucky enough to stumble onto an old track, they would pass. And if you dared to look, even for a fleeting second, they would look back. The man who told this story had ended it by saying that one can never truly know what lies beyond the veil of night, especially in places where the land remembers what man has long forgotten. He said that Mark never showed that photo to anyone. Or maybe, he had said, the flash had captured nothing at all, only darkness. And that thought, he added, was perhaps even more horrifying.
Waiting protocol. You never know what rules are written for your own protection. You never know what moves in the darkness next to you. Generations of generations, millennia. Other laws. Other beings. And their paths cross ours from time to time. And all you can do is lie in the dark, not looking, and praying that they don't notice you. But curiosity is stronger than fear. Sometimes a single flash can change your life forever, or destroy it. But horror doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes we invite it inside ourselves.
They say, along a stretch of coast where the land forgets its ambitions and the sea remembers its ancient power, a particular story is told. It's not shouted from the rooftops but murmured in hushed tones by those who have lived long enough to understand the weight of the ocean, a cautionary tale about a woman named Kira. She was, as the story goes, a seeker of the audacious, a chronicler of the palate's furthest reaches, ceaselessly driven by the digital hunger for clicks and the visceral thrill of the utterly new. Her blog, an archive of the bizarre and the exquisite, had led her across continents in pursuit of gastronomic extremes. And then, the whispers reached her, tales of a remote fishing village nestled in a forgotten cove, a place called Salt Grave, where an unparalleled delicacy was served, live caviar. It was recounted that Kira had arrived in Salt Grave on a day when the mist clung to the cliffs like a shy spirit, the air thick with the scent of salt and ancient fish. The village itself was a collection of weather-beaten shacks seemingly carved from the very rock face, its inhabitants as weathered and silent as the stones themselves. They were people who seemed to carry the weight of generations in their eyes, their gazes often fixed on the tumultuous gray expanse of the sea. She was said to have rented a small room overlooking the harbor, a room where the rhythmic slap of waves against the shore was a constant, insistent companion. Her inquiries about the fabled caviar were met with a curious mixture of reticence and pride. The villagers, it was observed, seemed to size her up, their silence a kind of test. Eventually, after a few days of patient waiting and a display of genuine curiosity, an old fisherman named Ronald, his face a road map of sun and sea, had finally gestured for her to follow him. He was said to have led her to a small, unassuming shed near the water's edge, its interior smelling strongly of brine and something else, something subtly metallic and profoundly alive. Inside, Kira was shown several large, crudely fashioned wooden tubs. In them, submerged in murky seawater, were what she was later to describe as grotesque mollusks, their shells not smooth and elegant, but gnarled and covered in what looked like barnacle-like growths, pulsating faintly as if with a hidden heartbeat. Ronald had explained, in a voice raspy like grinding pebbles, that these creatures were not of the shallow waters, but brought up from the abyssal depths, from where the light fears to tread. It was said that he spoke of them with a reverence that bordered on fear, his eyes wide and knowing. He had then, with a practiced hand, carefully extracted a handful of what he called their gift. What he presented to her, nestled on a dark piece of polished slate, was unlike any caviar she had ever encountered. It wasn't the uniform, glistening beads of sturgeon roe, nor the delicate pop of salmon eggs. These were, as she later attempted to describe in her frantic notes, individual, translucent orbs, each roughly the size of a small pea, but possessing an unnerving vitality. They slowly, subtly, pulsated, as if each contained a tiny, struggling heart. And more astonishingly, their colors shifted, a slow, mesmerizing play of iridescent blues giving way to watery greens, then to faint, unsettling yellows, before cycling back again. It was as if a nebula had been condensed into miniature, living spheres. She was assured by Ronald and other villagers who had gathered, their faces impassive, that this live caviar was not merely food. They were said to have told her it was a direct conduit to the ocean's ancient energy, a link to the primordial pulse of life itself. They spoke of incredible rejuvenation, of senses sharpened to an almost preternatural degree, and of a profound sense of connection with the vast, unknowable depths from which it came. Ronald had looked directly into her eyes, it was noted, and told her that it would make her feel truly alive, more alive than she had ever been. Despite the visceral unease that gnawed at her, Kira's journalistic instincts, coupled with her insatiable hunger for the extreme, had overridden her apprehension. This was precisely the kind of experience her followers craved, the kind of story that would cement her reputation as the daring pioneer of radical gastronomy. She was said to have taken a small, silver spoon, her hand trembling ever so slightly, and scooped a portion of the shimmering, pulsating spheres into her mouth. The initial sensation was unlike anything she had ever tasted. There was no distinct flavor of salt or fish, but rather an explosion of pure, unadulterated energy that seemed to flood her entire being. It was described as a wave of invigorating coldness that spread from her tongue to every nerve ending, followed by a warmth that settled deep in her bones. Her mind, she was said to have felt, had sharpened, colors seemed more vibrant, sounds more distinct. A profound sense of well-being, almost euphoric, washed over her. She felt, for the first time in years, truly vital, utterly alive, exactly as Ronald had promised. It was as if her entire body had been cleansed, purified, and re-energized from within. A deep, primal hum seemed to resonate through her, an echo of the ocean's boundless power. She remembered, it was later recounted, thinking that this was it, the ultimate experience she had been searching for. The euphoria lasted for several hours, a high-octane clarity that made the world seem vivid and new. but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, the first subtle shifts began. She was said to have noticed a faint, insistent murmur in the periphery of her hearing, a sound like a distant, rhythmic shushing. At first, she dismissed it as the actual sound of the surf, amplified by her newly heightened senses. Yet, even when she closed her window, the sound persisted, a soft, seductive whisper of the waves, seemingly originating from within her own head. Then came the thirst. It wasn't a dry, parched sensation, but a deep, unquenchable craving for water, not just any water, but specifically the cold, briny taste of the sea. She was said to have found herself drawn to the window, gazing out at the darkened expanse of the ocean, a strange, almost magnetic pull urging her closer. She drank glass after glass of tap water, yet the craving remained, a persistent ache in her throat. She mused, it was recounted, that perhaps it was merely a side effect of the extreme energy surge, her body recalibrating. The next day, her symptoms intensified. The whisper of the surf was no longer peripheral but a constant companion, a soft, hypnotic rhythm that began to drown out other thoughts. It spoke of endless currents, of fathomless depths, of ancient secrets hidden beneath the waves. Her craving for water had become an obsession. She consumed liters, yet remained parched, her body seemingly unable to hold or process the liquid. Her skin felt strangely dry, almost scaled, though no visible changes were yet apparent. She found herself walking the shoreline for hours, simply staring at the ocean, a strange, wistful longing building within her. The villagers, when she passed them, seemed to watch her with unreadable expressions, their silence no longer merely reticence, but something more profound, perhaps understanding. It was noted that her once sharp mind, though still capable of rational thought, began to feel unfocused, as if a part of her consciousness was being pulled in a different direction. Her meticulous planning and blogging responsibilities started to seem trivial, distant. What truly mattered, an insidious voice whispered from the depths of her own mind, was the ocean. A gnawing unease began to replace her initial euphoria. Kira, ever the investigative journalist, decided to delve deeper. She was said to have returned to Ronald, asking more pointed questions about the mollusks, about their origins, about any known side effects. Ronald, it was recounted, had simply stared at her with those knowing, ancient eyes, and had spoken only in riddles, mentioning the cycle of life, the renewal, and the sea reclaiming its own. He was said to have advised her that some questions were best left unasked, and some truths were too vast for human comprehension. Undeterred, Kira sought out the village's sparse library, a musty room filled with forgotten tomes and tide charts. It was there, amidst the brittle pages of old maritime journals and regional folklore, that she began to piece together the horrifying truth. She found cryptic references to deep-sea parasites, to mind-weavers from the abyss, often associated with legends of sailors driven mad, or children stolen by the tides. One particular faded sketch, accompanying a chilling account of a fishing vessel lost generations ago, depicted a mollusk eerily similar to those she had seen in Ronald's shed, and beneath it, a drawing of a human-like figure, its skin strangely mottled, its eyes hollow, staring out at the sea. Further research, painstakingly slow in the era before widespread digital access in such remote locales, eventually led her to a tattered, obscure biological survey from the early 20th century. It detailed a rare, deep-sea mollusk, Abyssalis pulsifera, and its parasitic life cycle. The caviar, it explained with chilling scientific detachment, was not food at all. It was the larval stage of a sophisticated, neurologically active parasite designed to seek out a suitable terrestrial host. Once ingested, the larvae burrowed into the host's nervous system, re-engineering its biology to suit their needs. They tapped into the host's own regenerative capabilities, explaining the initial burst of energy and rejuvenation. But their ultimate purpose was far more sinister. The document chillingly described how the larvae, once matured, would manipulate the host, driving it inevitably towards water, preferably the ocean. The host's body would then undergo a complete metamorphosis, its internal organs dissolving, its flesh and bones reconfiguring into a calcified, protective nest. This nest, now a living, breathing part of the ocean, would become a new home for the developing parasites, a place where they could grow into their adult mollusk form, ready to release a new generation of caviar into the currents. The host, effectively, would become a part of the mollusk, a morbid extension of its life cycle, its consciousness slowly fading as its body transformed into something utterly alien. Kira was said to have dropped the book, the thud echoing in the silent library. The whispers in her head intensified, no longer distinct from her own thoughts, but weaving into them, corrupting them. They were no longer the mere sound of the surf, but a symphony of the deep, a chorus of silent, patient entities calling her home. The thirst was now unbearable, a gnawing anguish that consumed her every waking moment. She felt, it was recounted, a growing aversion to dry land, to the solid earth beneath her feet. Her skin, she noticed with dawning horror, was indeed changing, losing its human softness, becoming slicker, almost iridescent in places, with faint, almost imperceptible ridges forming along her arms and legs. Her reflection in the tarnished mirror of her room showed a face that was no longer her own, not entirely. Her eyes, once sharp and curious, now held a milky, distant quality, reflecting the gray-green hues of the ocean. Her lips, once full, were now chapped and cracked, perpetually parted in a silent gasp for moisture. When she pressed her fingers to her chest, she felt a subtle, rhythmic thrumming beneath her ribs, deeper and more alien than her own heartbeat. It was the larvae, it was said, growing, maturing, taking hold. The transformation was subtle at first, then accelerated with terrifying speed. Her joints ached, not with soreness, but with a strange, deep-seated rearrangement. Her bones, it was recounted, seemed to soften and then reharden, molding into new, unfamiliar configurations. Her mind, once a fortress of intellect and ambition, was slowly being eroded, replaced by an instinctual, overwhelming drive. The urge to return to the ocean was no longer a craving but an imperative, a command issued from the deepest parts of her being, from the parasites that now were her being. She understood, with a chilling clarity that was perhaps the last vestige of her human consciousness, that she was no longer Kira, the blogger. She was a vessel, a living incubator, a future nest. One particularly stormy night, the wind howled like a banshee and the waves crashed against the shore with a furious roar. Kira was said to have walked out of her small room. She was not herself. Her movements were stiff, her gaze fixed on the tumultuous darkness of the sea. She wore only a thin nightgown, her bare feet already accustomed to the sharp pebbles and damp sand. The villagers, they say, watched her from their windows, their faces etched with a familiar sorrow and resignation. No one spoke, no one intervened. They knew the inevitable. She walked towards the crashing surf, the tumultuous water reaching for her like a lover. The whispers in her head were now a deafening roar, a symphony of triumph and welcome. Her body, they say, was no longer hers to command, but an obedient servant to the ancient, alien woe within. As the icy waves enveloped her, first her ankles, then her knees, then her waist, a shudder passed through her. It was not a shudder of cold, but of profound, terrifying release. Her last conscious thought, if it could even be called that, was not of her blog, or her followers, or her life on land. It was of an absolute, overwhelming sense of belonging, a terrifying homecoming. The ocean, vast and indifferent, embraced its new acquisition. The storm raged on, erasing her footprints, washing away any trace of the woman who had once sought the ultimate gastronomic thrill. What became of Kira, or rather, what became of her, no one in Saltgrave truly knows, or perhaps, no one truly speaks of. They only say that sometimes, on certain moonless nights, when the tide is low and the wind whispers strange, gurgling sounds, one might see unusual, gnarled mollusks clinging to the rocks in the deepest tide pools, larger than any found before, pulsating with an eerie, rhythmic low. And if you listen very closely, they say, you can almost hear a faint, distant hum, a lullaby from the depths, singing of a new generation, waiting to be born. The ocean, it remembers. And sometimes it reclaims its own.
Taste, sensation, euphoria. We are all looking for something new, something brighter. We want to experience life to the fullest. But is it worth it? Is a moment of ecstasy worth an eternity of transformation? When the body is no longer yours, and the mind gradually dissolves into the ancient whispers of the ocean, you become a nest, an incubator, part of a cycle much older than humanity. But even that is not the end. Sometimes horror awaits not in the sea, but in the mountains, and it is dressed in the mask of a joyful holiday.
The story, as it was told to me, began with the usual promise of a summer escape. A family, the Rossi, had set out from Milan, bound for the heart of the Italian Apennines. Marco, the father, had spoken of tracing the familiar, winding roads of his youth, eager to show his wife, Eleonora, and their 2 children, Sophia and Leo, the hidden beauty of the old country. He had described sun-drenched valleys and ancient villages clinging precariously to mountainsides, places untouched by time. They had been driving for hours, the initial excitement slowly dissolving into the drone of the engine and the children's increasingly restless complaints from the back seat. Sophia, the elder, had quietly read a book, while Leo, younger and more boisterous, had peppered his parents with questions about how much longer it would be. Marco had reassured them that they were almost there, that the familiar turn-off was just ahead. But the turn-off never appeared. The roads Marco remembered, the ones etched into his memory from childhood trips, seemed to have vanished. They found themselves on a stretch of asphalt that grew narrower, more overgrown, and increasingly unfamiliar. Eleonora had wondered aloud if they had taken a wrong turn, perhaps missed a sign. Marco, with a stubbornness born of pride and a rapidly depleting fuel tank, had insisted he knew these mountains, that the map in his mind was infallible. He had suggested that perhaps recent roadworks had altered the landscape, or that a new bypass had rendered the old routes obsolete. They had continued deeper into the mountains, the GPS signal long lost, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks. The frustration had mounted. Sophia had reportedly commented on the unsettling quietness of the forest they were passing through, a silence that seemed to absorb the sounds of their car. Leo had begun to fuss, complaining of hunger and a growing sense of discomfort. Eleonora had then gently, but firmly, suggested they pull over, consult a physical map, or at least try to find a village. Marco, finally admitting defeat, had conceded that perhaps they were indeed lost, a confession that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Just as the last vestiges of twilight began to paint the sky in hues of deep purple and orange, they had rounded a bend to find it. Nested in a deep valley, cradled by ancient, sloping hills, lay a town. Its houses, built of rough-hewn stone, seemed to glow with an inner warmth, their roofs crowned with terracotta tiles. A faint aroma of wood smoke and something sweet, like baking bread or ripe fruit, had wafted towards them. A sign, weathered but legible, had indicated the town's name, Valle della Luz, Valley of Light. A collective sigh of relief had passed through the car. Marco had accelerated, eager to find a gas station, a restaurant, a single soul who could point them back to the main road. The streets of Valle della Luz, however, were unnervingly empty. The car had echoed through the narrow lanes, past tall, closed wooden doors and windows adorned with iron grates. It was beautiful, undeniably, with blooming flowers spilling from window boxes, but it was also eerily silent, devoid of the children's laughter or the murmur of evening conversations one might expect in a village at dusk. They had eventually found a small piazza, dominated by a modest church with a bell tower. A few figures, elderly men and women, had been gathered near a fountain, speaking in hushed tones. As the Rossi family's car had pulled to a stop, all conversation had ceased. Every eye had turned towards them, not with suspicion, but with an unnerving, almost profound curiosity. Marco, stepping out of the car, had offered an apologetic smile, explaining that they were travelers, lost and seeking directions to the nearest highway. A tall, stooped man, his face a road map of wrinkles, had approached them, his eyes surprisingly bright and warm. He had introduced himself as Pietro, the town elder, and had then expressed immense delight at their arrival. He had gone on to say that it was truly a blessing, an unexpected joy to have visitors, especially on such a significant occasion. Eleonora had inquired about the occasion, and Pietro had explained, his voice soft but resonant, that the town was preparing for its annual feast of the Ascension. He had spoken of it as a time of deep tradition, of community, and most importantly, of welcoming. The other villagers had nodded along, their smiles wide, perhaps a little too eager. Pietro had then insisted, with an unwavering politeness that carried the weight of an unbreakable command, that the family could not possibly leave that night. He had stated that the roads out of Valle della Luz were treacherous after dark, especially for those unfamiliar with the terrain. He had then added that it would be a profound dishonor to their custom, a slight against the very spirit of the feast, if they were to try and depart. Eleonora had felt an immediate prickle of unease. She had reportedly whispered to Marco that the man's insistence felt less like hospitality and more like an obligation. Marco, however, had been swayed by the promise of a warm meal and a bed for his tired children. He had reasoned that a night's rest would do them good, and they could leave first thing in the morning. He had expressed their gratitude, and Pietro, with a satisfied nod, had led them to a small guest house at the edge of the piazza, promising them the finest meal the village had to offer. Throughout dinner, served in the guest house's rustic dining room by a kindly, silent woman, the villagers had continued to be overwhelmingly solicitous. They had brought plates piled high with pasta, roasted meats, and fresh vegetables, all delicious, Eleonora had to admit, despite her growing apprehension. They had asked many questions, polite inquiries about their journey, their home in Milan, their children's ages. But the questions, Eleonora had later reflected, had felt less like genuine interest and more like an inventory, a careful assessment. They had not offered many details about themselves, preferring to speak of the feast and its grand history. One older woman, her eyes like polished stones, had leaned in conspiratorially toward Eleonora and had revealed a key part of the tradition. She had explained that on the night of the feast, every household in Valle della Luz had to hang a lantern with red glass outside their window. She had then added that all doors and windows in the town must be left wide open, regardless of the chill in the air or the threat of night creatures. Eleonora had asked why this was necessary, and the woman, with a serene smile, had explained that it was so that he can pass through peacefully without delay. She had then remarked, almost as an afterthought, that anyone who failed to follow the custom, anyone who dared to close themselves off, would simply disappear. Not a trace, she had reportedly murmured, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond Eleonora, as if seeing an old memory. Marco, overhearing this, had dismissed it as quaint folklore, a local superstition designed to ensure conformity. He had reportedly told Eleonora that every village had its quirks, its old wives' tales. Eleonora, however, found herself increasingly unsettled. The politeness of the villagers, which had initially seemed charming, now felt like a carefully constructed facade, a barrier against something darker, more ancient. She had noted the subtle way their eyes lingered on Sophia and Leo, a possessive glint that she couldn't quite decipher. As night had fallen, the air in Valle della Luz had grown heavy with anticipation. The red lanterns had begun to appear, one by one, outside every window, casting an eerie, pulsating glow over the stone walls. The town had transformed, bathed in a blood-red light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The Rossis had watched from their guesthouse window, a strange blend of awe and fear gripping them. The woman from dinner had visited them again, gently reminding them of the custom, her voice unwavering as she had offered them a beautiful, intricately carved lantern with a deep crimson glass. She had then politely but firmly indicated that their own windows and door to the guesthouse should remain open. Eleonora had felt a chill that transcended the evening air. She had reportedly asked the woman what would happen if they did not comply, and the woman had simply repeated her earlier warning about disappearance, adding that it was a fate no one in Valle de la Luz ever wished to experience. She had then departed, her footsteps echoing softly down the cobblestone street. Marco, despite his earlier dismissal, had found himself obeying. He had hung the red lantern outside their window and had left the heavy wooden door to their room ajar, as well as the windows. The children, sensing the shift in their parents' mood, had grown quiet, their earlier excitement replaced by a palpable fear. Leo had reportedly asked his mother if he was a monster, to which Eleonora had offered no answer, simply pulling him closer. As the night deepened, Eleonora's unease had festered, transforming into a gnawing certainty that something was terribly wrong. She had noticed how Marco, though outwardly calm, kept glancing at the open door, his hand often going to his pocket where he kept his car keys. She had caught snatches of hushed conversations from below, the murmuring of villagers that seemed to gain intensity with the rising moon. It was then, in the suffocating quiet of their open room, that they had learned the true, horrifying purpose of the ritual. Through the open window, carried on the crisp mountain air, a fragment of conversation had drifted up from the piazza below. It was Pietro's voice, unmistakable, advising a younger man. Pietro had explained that the red lanterns were a sign, a demarcation. He had reportedly said that he was not looking for those who had closed themselves off, those who had defied the custom. No, Pietro had clarified, he did not seek to punish the disobedient among the town's own. He was looking for something else entirely. The younger man had asked for clarification, his voice trembling slightly. Pietro had then stated, with a chilling calmness, that he was looking for those who had never been part of the village. Those who had never lived under its customs, never breathed its air for more than a day. Those who were truly outsiders. Pietro had then finished by saying that it was only those who had just arrived, those whose presence was fresh and untainted by the village's long history, that he would take with him. The lanterns, the open doors and windows, were not for the villager's protection, but to guide him, to show him where the untouched ones resided. They were a beacon, marking the new arrivals. The words had hit Eleonora like a physical blow. She had looked at Marco, her eyes wide with the terror that mirrored his own. They were the outsiders. They were the ones who had never been part of the town. They were the targets. The politeness, the insistence on staying, the red lanterns, the open doors, it all twisted into a grotesque, elaborate trap. Marco had reportedly tried to move, to close the door, to pull the children away. But a strange, paralyzing fear had rooted him to the spot. Eleonora had grabbed Sophia and Leo, pulling them into a tight embrace, burying their faces against her, willing herself to become invisible. They had become acutely aware of the open door, a gaping maw in the darkness, inviting something in. Outside, the red light had intensified, seeming to pulsate with a slow, rhythmic beat. The silence in the town had deepened, becoming an oppressive weight. Not even the chirping of crickets dared to break it. They had heard it then, or rather, felt it. A presence, not a sound, but a vast, cold displacement of air, a shift in the very fabric of the night. It was as if the ancient stones of Valle de la Luz had begun to hum with a terrible, silent energy. Marco, gripped by a primal fear, had reported sensing a shadow, deeper than the night itself, moving slowly, deliberately, through the piazza. It did not make a sound, but the lanterns outside each window had flickered wildly as it passed, their crimson light momentarily swallowed, then spitting back to life. Eleonora, her heart hammering against her ribs, had felt the chill permeate their room, a cold that bit deeper than any mountain air. She had squeezed her children tighter, praying for dawn, for escape, for anything but the horrifying certainty that something vast and ancient was now at their threshold. They had waited, huddled together, listening to the impossible silence, feeling the oppressive weight of that unseen presence. The red light had pulsed, a beacon in the terrifying darkness. The open door, their only way out, was now their most terrifying vulnerability. And no one, the narrator concluded, had ever heard from the Rossi family again. The story, he had said, merely ended there, lost somewhere in the winding, forgotten roads of the Italian Apennines, a chilling tale whispered by those who still remembered the Valley of Light and the annual feast of the Ascension.
To get lost. To get to a place where time has stopped. Where you are welcomed as a dear guest. Where everything seems perfect. But perfect for them. For a ritual. A red lantern is not a decoration. An open door is not an invitation. It is a mark. It is a beacon for the one who comes in the night. And he is not looking for his own. He is looking for strangers. Fresh. Unconcealed. Like you? 6 stories. 6 roads you'd be better off never crossing. Yet they are everywhere. In the mountains, in the sea, in an old hotel, in the darkness of a train car. The world is steeped in ancient pacts, rituals, and beings that dwell beyond its borders. So tread carefully on your journeys. Think twice before you taste. Before you make a promise. Before you open a door. For you never know whether it is mere coincidence, or whether you are just another mark on the clock, another item on the market, another meal. For now, good night.